Something does not belong. You hear a question like that, and it sounds like it should have a clean answer. What powers was it said to possess? That feels like the kind of thing people would have settled a long time ago. A name? A claim. Maybe a few familiar ideas repeated often enough that they start to sound fixed. And once that happens, most people stop there. They hear the words, they accept the shape of them, and they move on. Because that is usually enough. If something is remembered for its powers, then those powers should stay recognizable. They should hold still. They should sound like what people always said they were, but they do not quite hold still. The closer you look, the less they seem to sit in one place. The words remain, but what they point to does not feel as settled as it should. What seems obvious at first begins to feel slightly off. Not loudly, not all at once. Just enough that what sounded familiar starts to feel less secure the moment you try to keep it in front of you. And that leaves you back at the same question. Only now it does not feel as easy as it did a moment ago. So what powers was it said to possess? The first descriptions make the power look simple. In the lamplit chamber, a gold ring lies on a dark cushion, its face crowded with letters too small to read at a distance. The records attached to it are later than Solomon by many centuries, but they agree on one practical point. When the seal was present, spirits obeyed. Not advised, not persuaded, ordered. Arabic accounts place jinn before Solomon as laborers and captives. Medieval retellings tighten the mechanism further by giving the authority a carrier, a ring engraved with a divine name. If the name was cut into metal and worn on the hand, command could be issued and enforced. That explanation seems to settle the matter when the construction stories are set beside it. Half-raised walls, cedar beams stacked in torchlit yards, stone platforms waiting for rooflines. These scenes recur in the tradition with unusual consistency. The builders are not masons but demons, or jinn, compelled into service. A line of dark figures kneeling before a seated king fits the same pattern. The seal, then, was said to possess executive force. It turned hostile or unruly beings into a workforce. The power was not merely symbolic kingship. It produced visible results. Walls, halls, transport, completion at impossible speed. But the doorway evidence introduces a narrower behavior that does not sit neatly inside construction command. In several accounts, an emblem impressed into wax or fixed above an entrance stops shadowed beings at the threshold. No palace order is being issued there. No labor is demanded. The force acts at a boundary. If the same seal can halt approach without speech, is its power still command? Or something closer to compulsion by presence alone? The wording of the sources presses both possibilities at once. Some say Solomon ordered the spirits. Others say the seal compelled them. That difference matters. An order assumes recognition of rank. Compulsion suggests an effect built into the marked object itself. The ring on the cushion begins to look less like royal insignia, and more like an instrument whose inscription did the work whether or not the wearer argued, threatened, or invoked anything further. Yet the object itself remains annoyingly unstable. The kneeling figures appear before a king, but the stopping force at the doorway is attached to an emblem in wax. If the power belonged only to a ring worn by Solomon, why do threshold marks perform the same restraint at a distance from him? If the emblem alone could block spirits, why do the narratives keep returning to a ring engraved with a divine name, rather than to a stamped sign used anywhere? For the moment, the strongest reading is still the oldest one. The seal of Solomon was said to give command over demons and jinn, enough to make them kneel, enough to make them build, enough to stop them at a marked boundary. But that leaves two practical questions lying open in the same chamber. Was the power in the king, in the inscription, or in the sign itself? And if the seal could command from a hand and bar from a doorway, what exactly was being transmitted? Authority, force, or both? At first, the power seems narrow enough to catalog. On one wall, a bronze amulet hangs from a cord against cracked plaster, its face cut with a hexagram, so shallow the lines nearly disappear under green corrosion. The reverse is smoother, worn by skin contact. That wear matters. It was carried, not stored. If the seal of Solomon was being used here, it was not only as a sign of command over spirits at a distance, it was being kept close to the body, as if danger approached the wearer directly. The desk nearby makes that reading feel secure. An open manual lies under dust, and in its center, a pentagram in red ink is boxed by short instructions in the margins. The repeated verbs are practical: bind, repel, adjure, close, not build, summon labor, or display royal authority. The seal here behaves less like a king's credential than a working defense. That would explain the amulet. It would also explain why the symbol migrates from ring to pendant to page. The power being claimed is protection. Then the cellar niche introduces a different problem. A clay jar sits upright in packed earth, its mouth sealed with pitch hardened into a black collar. Pressed into the pitch is a six-pointed sign. The jar is too small to be ceremonial storage, and too carefully closed to be ordinary refuse. The mark is not facing outward for display. It is centered over the closure itself. If the sign protected people from hostile beings, why place it where no wearer could benefit? The seal appears to be acting on containment, not merely defense. It is not warding off an approach. It is keeping something in. That reading gathers force in the sleeping room. A mat lies close to the inner wall. On it, a stamped pendant rests at the throat position of a body long gone. The outer door still carries gouges. 4 parallel claw marks at shoulder height, cut through old paint into the wood beneath. The damage is outside. The pendant inside. Protection again seems sufficient. The wearer slept under the seal, and whatever pressed at the door did not cross. But the spacing of the marks complicates that comfort. They are too regular, almost measured, and they stop at the latch line, as if the barrier mattered more than the room's occupant. The pendant may not have been shielding the sleeper from attack at all. It may have marked the room as closed territory, one more sealed space like the jar in the cellar. If so, the same sign is doing 2 jobs at once: guarding a person and defining a boundary. The manual's red pentagram sharpens the difficulty rather than resolving it. The surrounding notes do not reserve the figure for one use. A line beside the upper point calls for recitation over the afflicted. Another, lower on the page, specifies marking an opening before nightfall. The same page treats expulsion from a body and exclusion from a threshold as neighboring procedures. And if a threshold can be sealed, why not a vessel? If a vessel can be sealed, why not a chamber? So the question changes shape. Not whether the seal commanded demons. That answer now feels too small. But what kind of power could move so easily between pendant, page, door, and jar? A personal charm explains the worn bronze. A binding sign explains the pitched vessel. An exorcistic diagram explains the manual. Yet, the symbols do not even remain the same. Hexagram on the amulet, pentagram in the book, 6-pointed mark on the jar. If the power belonged to one fixed form, why do the records keep substituting another? The first page looks straightforward enough. On the left, a ring was drawn in profile, its bezel darkened to show an inset seal. Tiny letters ran around the face, too small in the reproduction to read cleanly, but clearly meant to be read. On the facing page, there was no ring at all, only a 6-pointed figure drawn flat in ink, with brief notes in the margin assigning it the same authority. If the question is what powers the seal of Solomon was said to possess, this pairing offers an easy answer at first. Command. Whether worn or drawn, it marked the thing that spirits were expected to obey. That explanation holds for several folios in a row. A parchment covered in circles and names lies beside a plain band ring in one study inventory. The ring is barely described, while the diagram receives careful labeling. Elsewhere, a tray of metal seals survives from a later collection, each cut with a different geometric figure: interlaced triangles, 5-pointed stars, forms with crossing bars, and the catalog notes attach nearly identical functions to all of them: restraint, adjuration, compelled appearance. The power seems to travel more easily than the object. Not one relic then, but a transferable sign of authority. That would account for why some sources show a ring and others only a figure. The seal's force would lie in recognized office, not fixed shape. Then the measurements begin to interfere. On one manuscript page, the drawn ring bears an inscription around the bezel. On another, the star alone is surrounded by names placed at each point. The geometry matches nothing exactly. The wording does not repeat. If authority was transferable in a simple way, why preserve the inscription so carefully? Why note letter order, point placement, line crossings? A sign that can be copied freely should not require this much textual precision. The wall charts sharpen the problem. Hung side by side, one bears a hexagram, the other a pentagram. Both are labeled as Solomon's seal in different hands from different centuries. Both are assigned protective and coercive uses in adjacent notes. If shape is secondary, that makes sense for a moment. The seal names a function, not a form. But the annotations do not behave as if the forms were interchangeable. The pentagram chart assigns names to 5 outer stations. The hexagram chart distributes them across 6. The procedures implied by each layout are not the same. The same power is being claimed through incompatible arrangements. A later comparison makes the contradiction harder to ignore. In one codex, the ring image is paired with a brief account of spirits compelled to appear. In another, the drawn star stands alone above a list of names and ranks, as if the figure were less a device for forcing obedience than a credential proving the right to address hidden beings at all. The plain band ring in the study inventory now looks less like the source of power than a support for inscription. The parchment beside it carries the operational detail. So, what was the seal said to do? Command spirits, certainly, but not only by being possessed. Across the pages, it also seems to identify, classify, and authorize. Yet that answer leaves the tray of differing metal seals unresolved. If the power depended on names and arrangement, why did later collections preserve so many distinct figures under the same title? And if the title itself carried the authority, what exactly were those figures expected to add? The first page that seems to answer the question is the easiest one to read. A grimoire lies open under dry light, its columns ruled with unusual care. Names, ranks, offices, numbers. Not charms for warding a doorway, not brief signs to hang on the body, but a census. The arrangement is administrative. One spirit governs one region, another commands legions, another answers only under a specified hour. If the seal of Solomon belonged to this page, then its power was not merely to force obedience. It certified recognition. It let its holder know who stood before him. That explanation sits well for a moment, because the next record agrees with it. Rows of labeled figures spread across a parchment on the table, each enclosed, each named, each assigned a place in an order. The labels matter more than the drawings. A binding formula in the margin does not begin with threat. It begins with identification. The sequence resembles legal procedure more than combat. One does not overpower what one cannot classify. Here the seal starts to look less like a weapon and more like a warrant backed by knowledge. Then the parapet scene intrudes. Birds crowd the palace edge in a dense black line, while the crowned figure below remains still, as if waiting for a response already expected. No demon ranks appear there, no constrained names, no ruled boxes. Yet later tradition folds this into the same authority. If the seal's power depended on knowing hidden beings by rank and title, why does the same current of mastery extend to animals? The records do not describe coercion in that scene. Nothing is bound. Nothing is threatened. The birds gather anyway. A seal impression beside a scroll, packed with names and sigils, narrows the question again. The impression is small, almost plain compared with the crowded writing around it. The scroll carries the burden of detail. Names, boxes, correspondences, invocations. The seal marks legitimacy. That would explain why later texts speak of divine grant. The force would not lie in geometry alone, nor even in possession of a marked object, but in authorized command over hidden orders already mapped in writing. The seal would prove that the speaker had standing, but the lists themselves do not stay still long enough to settle that. In one manuscript, a spirit appears as a king. In another, as a duke. The number of subordinate beings changes. Some names lengthen with added syllables, others contract, as if copied through languages that did not agree on their sounds. If the seal's power rested on exact knowledge, how exact did that knowledge need to be? A mistaken title should matter. A corrupted name should interrupt the whole procedure. Yet the traditions continue to attribute success to Solomonic authority, even when the catalogs drifted. That drift makes the birds on the parapet harder to dismiss. Perhaps the seal did not function only through lists. Perhaps the lists were later attempts to pin down a broader claim that Solomon had been given access to hidden order itself, whether in spirits, animals, or forces not visible at all. The ranked columns would then be evidence of one application, not the whole power. Still, the material record resists closure. The seal impression remains mute. It does not contain the columns. It does not display the ranks. It sits beside them, certifying something the scroll must supply. So what, exactly, was said to reside in the seal? Knowledge, command, protection, divine permission, or only the sign that these had been granted elsewhere? The pages answer by accumulation, and each added name leaves the central object less isolated and less clear. The first inventory entry looks straightforward enough. A royal object, small enough to vanish, important enough to empty a throne. In one manuscript illustration, an open box sits on a table with its lining intact, no sign of force damage, while the seat behind it is left unoccupied. The accompanying note does not describe a kingdom losing wisdom, or favor, or judgment. It records something narrower and more mechanical. Once the seal was gone, commands no longer held. That would explain the powers people attached to it. Not merely prestige, but enforceable authority. Over spirits, over labor, over whatever answered only when the object was presento. For a moment, that fits almost too well. If the power traveled with possession, then later claims make sense. Whoever held the seal, held the command. The stories of demons building, obeying, withdrawing, those would depend less on Solomon's person than on the thing itself. The vacant throne and the empty box belong together. Then the city scenes begin to interfere. In several later accounts, the missing object is not hidden in a treasury or buried in a wall. It is airborne, carried off by a hostile being, shown in the claws of a dark figure above the roofs. That image is usually treated as embellishment, but the text beneath it is more precise than the painting. The usurper does not simply steal a jewel. He assumes rule. If the seal's power was command over demons alone, why does the loss produce political displacement? Why does the palace gate close to its former owner? A ragged figure appears outside those gates in another cycle of images, while another occupant sits within. The contrast is not symbolic decoration. It is procedural. The authority transferred. Access transferred. Recognition transferred. The seal, then, was said to do more than compel spirits. It authenticated rule. It made commands legible to others, human, demonic, or both. That explanation holds until the recovery tradition is laid beside it. The most persistent recovery scene is not a coronation chamber, but a market slab. A fish opened, a ring glinting in the belly. The setting is almost aggressively ordinary. If the object conferred visible sovereignty, why does it reappear through concealment, digestion, accident? And if a demon or a usurper could wield it effectively, why lose it in so clumsy a chain of custody? The answer offered by the text is practical, rather than grand. The ring can be worn, taken, dropped, swallowed, hidden, recovered. Its powers are attached to possession in the most literal sense. Once regained, authority returns. That would account for the humiliation interval found in so many versions. The man remains Solomon, but the operative force is absent. The seal protects only while held. Yet the records do not settle there either. Some copies describe the stolen object as enough to strip him of command. Others still insist the recovery required recognition, not mere retrieval. A ring in a fish's belly is only metal until identified. A usurper on a throne is only an intruder, unless the seal answers him. So what exactly was said to reside in it? Protection, command, kingship, or proof? At this stage, the evidence keeps circling one stubborn point. The powers were real in the stories only when the object was in the right possession. But the stories cannot agree whether that possession worked by simple custody, lawful identity, or something the ring itself could verify. At first, the power looks easy to classify. In one chamber drawing after another, the operative element is not the outline of the seal, but the writing on it. A metal ring, engraved with dense, divine names, lies inside a chalk circle on a stone floor. The circle is measured, not decorative. Its radius repeated in the margins of nearby instructions. On the wall, sheets of parchment are pinned in rows. Seals, invocations, counted steps, prescribed hours. The language is procedural. Inscribe this name. Stand here. Speak in this order. If the seal of Solomon was said to possess power, these pages suggest where that power was thought to reside. Not in a king's inherited gift, not in a shape by itself, but in a licensed command activated correctly. That would explain why so many different forms survive. In the same room, different symbols painted on separate tablets are arranged around a brazier. Some 6-pointed, some 5-pointed, some not star-shaped at all. Yet the accompanying notes assign them similar functions. Constrain, compel, protect, dismiss. The geometry varies. The formulas do not vary as much. A narrow strip of text wraps around one seal face so tightly that the letters nearly become border pattern. The inscription occupies more surface than the figure at the center. That proportion is hard to ignore. If the seal was said to command spirits, perhaps it did so as a credential, a visible warrant bearing sacred names, effective only when joined to recitation and boundary making. Then the measurements begin to interfere. Several diagrams specify circles large enough for a standing operator, but the surviving seals paired with them are too small to be legible at ritual distance. Their letters are cut for touch or close inspection, not for display. If the seal's authority had to be recognized by what was engraved on it, who was meant to read it? The human user could barely do so in low light. The spirit, if one follows the manuals literally, was expected to obey before the object could even be examined. The wall texts offer a partial answer. Some instructions treat the written names as things that need not be seen once inscribed. They need only be present in the proper place, enclosed within the proper figure, spoken in the proper sequence. That makes the ring less like a badge and more like a component in a larger apparatus. The power attributed to the Seal of Solomon would then include binding and protection, because the seal was one element in a controlled environment. Circle, name, timing, utterance. But the room preserves another difficulty. The same invocation appears beside incompatible symbols, and one tablet carries no central figure at all, only concentric bands of names. Elsewhere, a star is carefully painted with no inscription inside it, while the adjacent note still labels it. The seal. If sacred names were essential, why does an unlabeled figure remain in the set? If the figure alone was insufficient, why keep multiple geometries in parallel and call each effective? The records do not settle the matter. They keep widening it. The powers attributed to the seal, command, restraint, protection, remain attached to whatever combination of sign, inscription, and spoken formula a given text considered lawful. The object on the floor, the diagrams on the wall, the smoke gathering above the marked circle. Together they make one explanation feel almost complete. Then the duplicate symbols, the unreadable engravings, and the blank-centered seals leave a practical question hanging in the chamber. What, exactly, was believed to do the commanding? The mark, the name, the voice, or the authority they were trying to assemble for a moment and hold? Under separate lamps, the display table first suggests a simple answer. A ring, a hexagram amulet, a pentagram talisman, a bound grimoire. 4 forms, 1 reputation. If the question is what powers the Seal of Solomon was said to possess, the arrangement seems to sort itself. The ring belongs to command. The amulets belong to protection. The book belongs to summoning and restraint. The symbols differ, but the function appears stable. Authority over hostile, unseen beings. That reading holds for a while. In one cabinet, a sealed jar sits beside a protective pendant and a manuscript of spirit names. The grouping is awkward. If the seal only drove demons away, the jar is not defensive. Its pitch seal is deliberate confinement. The manuscript is not a charm either. Its columns of names, ranks, and marks look administrative, almost taxonomic. Protection explains the pendant. It does not explain why the same sign appears where something is being kept in, not kept out. So the power broadens. Not merely warding, but binding. Not merely binding, but identifying. The manuscript pages help that explanation along. Names paired with signs. Signs paired with instructions. Instructions paired with constraints. The seal begins to look less like a weapon than a credential. It does not strike spirits. It places them under order. That would account for the old stories of Solomon commanding demons to build, and for later manuals that use Solomonic seals to summon and restrain. Then the recovered ring on velvet complicates the cabinet's neat logic. Beside it lie a torn robe and a royal crown. The damage is not symbolic decoration. The robe is split at the shoulder seam, abraded at the hem, as if worn through a period of displacement. The crown is intact. The ring is present. If authority came from wisdom alone, why do so many accounts insist that once the ring was taken, rule itself went with it? Why should a king's command over spirits, animals, or hidden things depend on possession of a small engraved object that could be lost, stolen, swallowed, and recovered? That question makes the ring look less like a sign of office, and more like the office itself. For a moment, that explains nearly everything. Demon command traditions, stories of humiliation after theft, recovered authority after return. The power was attached to the object, but the wall of hanging diagrams stands a few paces away, and no two seals share the same shape. Some are 6-pointed, some 5-pointed, some not stars at all. Several manuscript copies assign the same effects to different figures. If geometry carried the force, the variation is too wide. If one original relic guaranteed authenticity, why do drawn forms in manuals claim the same results as engraved metal? The grimoire on the table answers part of that, and opens the rest. Its seals are never left alone. Around them run divine names, invocations, measured placements, ranked lists. The sign is paired with speech, inscription, and lawful formula. That would explain why multiple forms could function under one name. The power lay in sanctioned command, not in a single outline. Yet the pendant in the cabinet still hangs there without any visible ritual apparatus, and traditions still call it Solomon's seal when worn simply for safety. So the record settles nowhere cleanly. In one cluster of evidence, the seal commands spirits. In another, it imprisons them. Elsewhere it protects the bearer, reveals hidden orders, marks royal legitimacy, and can even be lost in a way that strips that legitimacy away. The name remains constant, while the mechanism keeps moving. Relic, symbol, inscription, procedure, authority. The objects under the lamps do not agree on which of these came first. They only agree that people expected the seal of Solomon to do more than one thing, and expected those powers to overlap.